All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter, at FDRLST. Today, I wanted to have a conversation with a guest who we've had on before to talk about his great work within fields of research related to not just the populist rise in recent years in America, but across the world. Eric Kaufmann is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He's the author also of Whiteshift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities. You can follow him on Twitter at EPKaufM. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today from London.
Great to be back, Ben.
I want to talk to you about this feature piece, this lengthy piece that you wrote for Quillette, which appeared on the 22nd. The title is The Great Awokening and the Second American Revolution. And after I read it, I sent it around to a number of different people, and I've made reference to it to a number of folks. I brought it up on Friday with the president and to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, just as something that in particular Meadows ought to look at, because I don't think the president might have the patience to go through the whole thing.
Right.
But in addition to the argument that you made in this piece, you had some survey data that I think really jumped out, and that a number of different people, independent of my sharing it, were forwarding to me. Tell me a little bit about the argument you were making in the piece before we get into that survey data.
Yeah, I was really interested to know what the limits were of the desire to, if you like, remake American culture on the left. And this was before the George Floyd killing and the subsequent rioting. I was kind of interested because I'd seen in some other work I'd done that if you mention, well, this is about structural racism and discrimination and people of color and so on, you can actually shift people's opinions quite a bit. And I was interested to know, okay, so statues of coming down, that's something we've already seen. How far would they go in terms of, for example, would they want to have a new flag for the United States? Is America a name that's tainted with European colonialism? So at what point would people say, well, no, actually, this is far enough? And really, so I devised these 16 questions, which I asked in early May, across a couple of survey platforms, and those kind of lean whiter than average and maybe about 10, 12 years younger than average. So they're not picking up exactly a representative sample, but kind of what's coming down the pike, if you like. And what I found was that on 6 of these questions, a majority of liberals actually endorsed the measures, including a new anthem, a new constitution, and actually for those who describe themselves as very liberal, removing Mount Rushmore. So these are really quite radical things. And then, of course, we had the George Floyd protests, and I thought, well, what an opportunity to ask these questions again. And what you saw was that across those 16 questions, there was quite a substantial shift over a half scale point out of 5, and pretty dramatic. So it seems like opinion has gone even further towards just tearing up the existing cultural landscape and starting with a fresh sheet of paper. And that kind of worried me, because you've seen these sorts of movements in other times and periods in history, and usually nothing good comes of them.
Well, I want to get into that history, but before we do, let's talk about these questions that you devised, which I think are very well crafted, because they're designed in a way that they soften the nature of what's actually being done. In other words, you're couching it in terms of, well, we're going to do these things in a very respectful way, or in a very, careful way. We're going to proceed to do this thing. But then the thing that you're actually doing is really crazy, or most Americans, I think, would say it's really crazy. When I brought up the question about Mount Rushmore, it was because the president's going there on Friday for the first fireworks display that they've done there in more than a decade, which wasn't about politics. It was about like beetles and land management,
right.
Risk of fire. So he's going to go there and presumably give some speech. I assume he'll wrap himself in the flag and make it all patriotic and stuff, because that's what he tends to do. But I brought up the fact that your survey found that 44% of liberals and 58% of very liberals were in favor of knocking the whole thing down. And it's funny because one of my younger writers, Tristan Justice, had tweeted about 2-3 weeks ago or something like that. He had tweeted something about like, oh, this is ridiculous. We're going to be, I thought this whole, that the Mount Rushmore thing, basically, he had seen some of it percolate up and he thought it was ridiculous. And now he posted something the other night basically saying, I'm amazed at how quickly I was proven wrong. And the president's reaction to that was, I think there are a lot more people on the other side of that 44%. But my reaction to it is more, if that's 44% right now, and there's a lot of momentum and wind in the sails of folks who want to achieve pretty extreme things, what do they do next? What's the next thing? Or how much does that grow? Talk to me a little bit about the trend lines that you've seen in your survey data on these points, and how quickly a lot of these things have become central to what a lot of liberals believe.
Well, yeah, because I think if you go back and you remember the initial controversy over the Confederate statues, and it was almost mooted that, well, what's next? I think the president mentioned Jefferson and Washington, and of course, lo and behold, that's now happening. And then I guess, so really there is a potential here for mission creep, if you like. And I think two things in the survey. One is pre and post Floyd, we see a major statistically significant shift of over a half scale point in the direction of this cultural revolution. And secondly, younger people in the survey, substantially more than older people, favor these changes. And I think both of those things would tell us that if a movement like this continues, and as you get generational turnover, this becomes more and more of a possibility. So I don't think we should dismiss it out of hand just because at present the majority are not with them.
One of the big differences between, say, fiscal policy and these types of cultural conflicts is that there are natural things that tend to happen in life that might make you change your socialist ways to being a little more tolerant of capitalism as you get older. You start to care more about property tax rates. You start to care more about where your kids go to school and school districts. You start to care about, your retirement and investments. And so there's a natural tendency where if you're, on the left fiscally when you're younger, you might get to be more in the center or even to the right as you get older. With these cultural battles, I'm not sure that that's going to happen, in the sense that if you accept this idea that America is fundamentally and in some ways irredeemably racist, and that its founding is corrupted by this racism and by slavery, I don't know what pulls you out of that spin. I don't know what takes that 44% number down, in other words.
Yeah, and I agree. I think this is the issue, is that once you start to see the world in one dimension, racist or non-racist, and if you apply that software, I use the analogy of once you've downloaded that software and you see everything in those terms, then it doesn't matter how much good Jefferson might have done on liberalism, on founding a university and a nation. All of that is irrelevant. It falls away because all you're seeing is, owned a slave. And so therefore, the more people that download that software and see the world that way, those anti-racist values simply trump other considerations and will simply drive the narrative. So again, I agree. I think until someone comes up with a limiting principle that can say, well, actually, that has to be put in its proper perspective as one strand amongst 10 strands. And yes, maybe at the extreme, we might take down a statue, but there has to be some contextualization of the complexity of people, and also the people who, by the way, observe these statues. This idea that white people are triumphantly racist when they see Jefferson and black people are aggrieved. Well, no, actually, there's multiple interpretations, including just being interested in history. And that just doesn't seem to enter this conversation.
It was amazing to me to see how quickly the conversation moved past all of these historians who were quoted in pieces back in 2017, disagreeing with the president on Washington and Jefferson being next. The Washington Post, the New York Times, several other publications ran these things where they had, 8 different history professors saying, oh no, that's not going to happen. It's not the same. Here's why it's not the same. And that's all rational and fine and logical. But I think that what the president grokked in that moment that the historians didn't necessarily was that this was part of a rising tide, and that it wasn't just there wasn't a clear line of demarcation between, well, we shouldn't have these men because, put on pedestals in our town squares because they were traitors who rebelled against the Constitution, which is a perfectly decent argument. But he understood, I think, that wasn't actually the argument being made. And it was much more about these were racists who defended the institution of slavery, and that you could say the same of so many people in our history who we have given great respect to and who've been our presidents. When you look at the historical trends on this, you mentioned earlier that in moments like this, you've seen movements like this rise before, and that usually they don't result in good things. What are some examples of that, and what kind of nature do these movements take upon themselves?
Yeah, I mean, well, a good example that it took place in the middle of the 20th century is the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And in fact, my dad was even in China during the Cultural Revolution and tells the stories about Mao's Little Red Book and people, children being told to spear enemies of the regime. But yeah, it's really interesting because they had this concept of the four old habits, old customs, old ideas. They wanted to wipe the slate clean so that they could remake the new socialist, China. And so what they were doing was actually destroying, old books were burned. Anything from ancient China was they were trying to destroy it. Confucius's tomb was looted. This kind of desecration and vandalism in the service of an extreme idea. And what you get these movement entrepreneurs are always trying to take it to the next level, to impress everybody else and to show their virtue and essentially to punish dissidents. It's all part of the same mood where this idea that, oh, you're actually a supporter of the capitalist regime, and look, you've got some old books. Why do you have these old books? You must be a suspect. So again, this sort of fervor, it comes out of trying to iron out particularity in history and culture to create this brand new heaven on earth, this utopian civilization. So we've seen that in China, and we've seen it elsewhere. I'd say ISIS is another example of that, where in the case of ISIS, it was to get at the pure Islam and to wipe away any human contributions that they deemed to be not God's contributions. So any elements of culture, history, shrines, anything had to be destroyed, anything about the old world. So yeah, I don't think these movements lead to very good things.
I've told this anecdote to a couple of people, but to me, the shining example of clear coverage of this moment comes from Minneapolis, where a reporter for a local indie publication quoted one of the protesters who had just knocked down a statue of a Union soldier, which they eventually hauled into and dumped into a lake. And he was looking at it and he said, "Who even is this guy?" and I feel like that's kind of the problem that we face, because there is no ability to, I think, teach history when people are pulling down statues. You can't be the historian, the academic, standing up at the statue and saying, "Hey, let me tell you why you shouldn't pull this down," because that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and so my fear is, if the problem here is one of education, and one where the natural trajectory of a lot of major figures of the media, including the 1619 Project and others, has been to play up America's racist history or the history of slavery as being central to the American experiment, then I'm not sure that this is something where we're going to be able to pull this string back in any real way, especially given the context of the political moment. Do you see any path through that? Do you see any, do you have any optimism about an ability to maybe teach in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point, because this is ideologically driven. The question is how it can be resisted. I mean, there's sort of two real paths. One, which I talk about, called cultural nationalism, where this is the conception of nationhood that values tradition and content and seeks to defend it. So it's not just America as an idea, but actually some of the forms of the expression of that idea, such as a flag or anthem, as things that people are attached to and would want to defend, and that's got validity. That's number one. But secondly, in theory, one could imagine a school system and a university where the teacher would say, well, look, the oppressor-oppressed paradigm or the racist, non-racist paradigm is one way of looking at things, but it's one of 10 ways of looking at things. And you also want to look at development of the U.S. as a nation and the development of liberalism. And when we put all that together, maybe we shouldn't tear this down. Now, that's, I think, a long way off. And so I think it's going to have to be a combination of both. The people who are attached to these symbols kind of speaking up and saying, hey, this matters to us, and we oppose taking them down, and that's part of democracy. And second, more of the academics and historians saying, this is a valuable piece that once destroyed, we can never bring back. It has a lot of lessons to teach, whatever story you want to tell. And so I think we need both of those voices in this conversation to try and stop this.
What does cultural nationalism, as you describe it, look like when applied through the realm of politics?
Well, yeah, I mean, historically, again, going back to the 19th century, a lot of cultural nationalism was about protecting language. So if we think about the Czech language or the Estonian or the Irish language, it was a way of preventing languages from being assimilated and homogenized. Or it was a way of rescuing the history of a people that was about to be washed away. And I think similarly, what that looks like is essentially the conservatives will have to get involved in debates over school textbooks, over flags and emblems, over statues, over memorials, and put some effort into pushing back a bit on the drift of the culture. Whereas I think conservatives have been mainly focused on things like foreign policy, low tax, etc., but not on these questions of protecting the particularity and distinctiveness of forms of cultural expression that have taken place in the country and to which people are very much attached. And of course, you might have people who have a different view on Columbus, and that is fine. Maybe an Italian American takes a lot of pride in Columbus, and maybe a native Indian American really doesn't, and that's fine. But I think there has to be some respect for, okay, I have issues with this, the other person has a different perspective. Let's find an accommodation that hopefully preserves the best of both and that isn't so zero-sum. And so I think that cultural nationalism is an important perspective. Again, I stress this, the view that says America is just an idea, actually, in my view, is conducive to this sort of iconoclasm, because if it's just an idea, then all the cultural forms are expendable, right? Whereas my view is it's got to also be that some of these distinct cultural forms and vernacular architecture, various things, the everyday things have to be a part of what you also want to try and conserve. And that's perfectly valid philosophically from a sort of communitarian cultural standpoint. It's perfectly valid, but I think the argument needs to be made.
One of the things that I think people underestimate about the gaps between young and old on these issues, and I think it's actually something that undergirds the subdued reaction in polling to this protest movement and to some of the iconoclasm we've seen, is how much these views have been around for a while, and as you write, have gone on this long left modernist march through our institutions. You cite the experience of all of these people having these ideas filtered through not just K through 12, but higher education. And you quote some polling statistics that say 63% of millennials aged 22 to 37 now agree that America is a racist country. Nearly half say it is more racist than other countries, and 60% that it is a sexist country. Older generations are less radical, but 40 to 50% of boomers and Gen Xers agree with these statements, reflecting the long march of the new left through American culture. I think that one of the elements of this that people underestimate is that why things like this can become acceptable as an idea is that it is not simply confined to a radical portion of the young. That is actually more widespread than that, and that it's been an enduring and increasing element of what people have learned about the country. Do you think that Americans would be surprised by the level of racism that has existed historically in other nations around the world if they spent the time to learn about it?
Yeah, I think they would. And I don't know whether this is sort of a willful denial of what's gone on in other countries or indeed, I mean, for example, slavery, which exists very much in today's world in places like Libya. Yeah, I think it's partly an ignorance of just how bad it is elsewhere and also an ignorance of history. I'm just not sure whether it's a willful ignorance or whether it's a genuine ignorance. But yeah, I think anyone who really is familiar with survey data, for example, and with actual conditions would realize how ridiculous the statement that the US is more racist and sexist than other countries in the world is. But I don't think that's being taught. I think, in a way, what's being taught is this, what I call left modernism, which is a fusion ideology, which is kind of like, if you like, the cultural left meets individualist anarchism, right? So this is kind of the animating ideology, and that can adapt itself both to a woke corporate version and also to an anarchist left version. And that's why we see the corporations now getting behind this in a way that we didn't see in the past. We saw it to a lesser extent. And that's partly what gives it more heft with celebrity endorsements and corporate endorsement. And I think that's moved a lot of people. I haven't been able to prove this, but I think it moves a lot of people in the middle to say, oh, yeah, actually, maybe they have a point and maybe this statute should come down. And of course, it's a slippery slope from that point on, even though I hate slippery slope arguments, but I do think there is a strong degree to which this could creep because of the ideological power behind it.
You know, there's an element of that I'm curious about, and I wonder if you agree with me. One of the ideas that I've had in recent years is that as we've seen the decline of faith in so many institutions, that one of the key aspects of this has been the decline of faith in the church and religious organizations, not just as institutions, but as moral arbiters, that we no longer have them as the center of our moral conversation. And in its place, we've actually seen the rise of these moral corporations, where basically you get your moral fix, your feeling that you are doing good from the items that you purchase and the companies that you listen to, and the little symbols on the thermos that you buy at Starbucks that says that that you're doing good by buying this tchotchke as opposed to just buying a tchotchke, and that with that has come an odd authority when these companies speak on matters of morality. I mean, one example of that would obviously be a very prominent one, would be the way that we treat Mark Zuckerberg now, as if he's supposed to be, not just, the head of a large social media company, but, I've made the joke that we basically treat him like the Pope, as if he's supposed to come down and like render judgment on the right and the wrong of something that is out there, as opposed to just being somebody in Silicon Valley trying to run a company, and so I guess my point just being, we expect so much more of these corporations now in signifying and in representing our values, and as a consumer culture, the natural tendency to use social media to organize, oh well, we're now going to boycott or to make a yell fest about the advertising used by these major corporations, obviously many of which just declared that they would be suspending their ad revenue from Facebook in July because of objections over their unwillingness to label content or to judge, fact check, or tamp down on what is now referred to as hate speech, but is often just objectionable content. I worry that we've given these corporations, the great irony of this socialist, pro-socialist kind of moment is like, we've given these corporations this massive moral authority over how we live our lives, and I feel like that's something that has replaced in many ways the old ways that we might have been able to work as neighbors to decide these things for ourselves. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth. So I do definitely think this is a secular religion. Mm-hmm. Now, it is also true that Marxism was a secular religion, and to some extent nationalism is too. But for example, John McWhorter's concept of the religion of anti-racism, which I think is a very useful one, that if you think about the concept of being fallen, of having sinned, right? So this particularly the white male as having sinned, and this original sin has to be atoned for. and you can get a redemption by being an ally, and together we will walk in the light in the 1,000-year reign of multiculturalism. Right? So that's kind of it has a very religious structure, and you have, if you get somebody like a Ta-Nehisi Coates or an Ibram Kendi who makes an argument, you're meant to bow and genuflect and not to sort of say, okay, what's your evidence, and let's question that. So clearly these are sacred values that are not something that are amenable to scientific scrutiny, and that's all absolutely the case. And you have this corporations simply jumping on this kind of herding bandwagon where you might have seen signs of the devil. It's now the devil is the racist, right? So I think that very much works. And I think the connection too perhaps with religion is this idea that tradition, well, either religious or national, that kind of culture that kind of memory and narrative seems to have lost its purchase, is losing its purchase. And some of the newer, this new religion of anti-racism, which is also, of course, you've got religion of anti-sexism and anti-ableism and everything, all of which falls under this left modernism, which I would call. I mean, that new ideology is hitting its peak of influence, which I would say it's a 100-year peak. I mean, certainly takes off in the 60s, but we're into what I would call the third great awokening of this ideology, whereas the late 60s was the first, the second was in the early 90s with political correctness, and now we're seeing a third, probably more powerful wave, which is more the corporations on board. And so this is something I think historians will look back on as a major force, and not just in the US, but worldwide.
There is a political element of this that I'm curious about your perspective on. A viral TikTok with 3 different girls on it, making the case that no one should wear red, white, and blue has been passing around the social media lately, and basically saying that on the 4th of July, if you wear red, white, and blue, that it's a signifier of political allegiance to Donald Trump, that you shouldn't fly a flag, that you shouldn't, basically attacking kind of patriotic colors and symbols, saying that you should wear a rainbow instead, and that you shouldn't engage in any of the traditional, patriotic symbolism and the like. There's a number of Democrats who've said this. Bill Press said it, Al Sharpton said it, a couple of others have said it. Some variant of the biggest mistake Democrats ever made was that we let Republicans have the Bible and the flag. And that's a simplicity, I think, or a simplification, I should say. But there is some truth to it in the sense that Republicans are much more closely associated with traditional American religion, and they're much more associated with traditional American expressions of patriotism. Do you view this as something that is permanent or at least semi-permanent in American politics, just given the way that these priorities have shifted around and the survey data that you're seeing from liberals, in the sense that, not that long ago, Jim Webb was a senator from the state that I live in, 10 years ago. And, Secretary of the Navy and a former Republican, and very patriotic, very pro-military, very pro the white working class experience, particularly cared about Scots-Irish, folks, and had that as a priority. Has written all about that, and had a piece in the Wall Street Journal actually this weekend about the hard hat riots from the 1970s. Right. And what I've been saying basically is maybe it's just a situation where he and everyone like him not being in the Democratic coalition anymore, or not being important to the Democratic coalition anymore, meant that they didn't have to pretend to care about the things that they cared about. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. And I think also there's been this shifting in religious and patriotic attitudes, right? So, for example, the number of people who have no religion, and those are overwhelmingly Democratic voters. That's only really increased sharply in the last, say, 10, 20 years. And so you really wouldn't have had a significant atheist, non-religious population even in the 1980s or 90s. And so there is now that constituency. It's quite sizable amongst people under 35. So you now can start to have a politics without religion. And similarly, I think on the patriotic side, again, if you have this software that just breaks the world into oppressed versus oppressor, then you start to see racism in everything. And the flag might be one area where, and as this ideology unfolds its logic, you get these entrepreneurs trying to take it to new levels. One new level could be, yeah, maybe we're going to change the flag. Maybe we're going to change the names of states and towns and all these things that significant numbers of people were saying yes to in the survey become possible. Things which wouldn't have been thinkable suddenly become thinkable. And so I think we shouldn't take too complacent an attitude to these things.
The devil's advocate position from someone who is relatively apolitical would be, what's the harm? Some of these people have problems with these statues. It doesn't make a big difference in my life, whether they're up or not. People have problems with the names of buildings at Princeton. What does that mean to me? They don't
Right.
they have a problem with, the name on the street. I don't really care. I'm just trying to drive on it. Basically,
Correct.
that for the vast majority of Americans, these elements are not central to their life. They don't particularly understand them. They don't particularly care what's going on, so long as it does not affect them or their businesses. Until you actually have, main streets boarded up, not just, in kind of hot zones, but across the country, people don't really feel like this is something that is affecting them negatively. And so you see this movement kind of march on. What argument would you make as a leader, not necessarily political, but in the community, to tell them this is why you actually should care about this. This is why it is important to us about the kind of nation that we are?
Well, I guess my view is that communities which are multi-generational, which have collective memories that span generations, have a value to them, and that's kind of behind the sort of communitarian arguments that I tend to find persuasive, not to the extreme, but the fact also that there are people who value these traditions and cultures. I mean, imagine going into a Northwest Native Indian reservation and chopping down a totem pole. Now you might say, well, it's just a piece of wood, and hey, you can enjoy your house and drive your car. Well, okay, but these things matter to people, and in a way, if you go through life without any of these, you can do that. That's fine. But I think something is lost. And even if we get away from cultural nationalism and just talk about, look, if you just want to be a cosmopolitan, you want to visit interesting places with rich histories and pasts, if that past has all been torn down, then that's a net loss to humanity as well. So I think you can actually go at this from a number of different directions, that losing that heritage and that memory is I think a loss to all of us, really.
Yeah.
I say that as someone who's not American.
Yeah. Well, I think that an element of this too that, matters to me is when I came to visit London, much of the time that I spent was focused on history that now I'm sure is being deemed damnable. And, not just the Churchill statues, but, the history that is attendant around him is something that, I've visited and studied and looked at, quite a bit. Going through the British Museum and really all of the museums in the area is amazing and impressive. And of course, much of that is founded in empire and in the benefits of bringing a lot of things back. Now, I understand controversy around that, but the point is, there is great value in being able to appreciate what has been preserved and what has happened, and in learning from it, and in learning from it in context. My fear in this moment is that there is no end to the willingness of the leftist radicals to forget everything that came before in service of their mission. I was sitting with a friend of mine who is gay the other day, and he kind of leaned in and he said, I don't really want to say this because I feel like everyone will start agreeing with me, but they do realize that every one of these statues is a homophobe. and he said it from the perspective of like someone who doesn't want any of them to come down. He's just like, they do realize that like by the measures that we have today, every one of these people is problematic. And
sure.
yeah. And so I feel like there's no stopping it.
Well, if you think of all the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, if you really focus on how they were made, how the pyramids were made and the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and all the people who died building them, yeah, you'd probably want to blow them up if you just saw the world through this
Yeah.
lens of oppressor oppressed. And yeah, I think that's why it's such an impoverished way of looking at the world. But I also think that these things matter to people and to communities as well, right? So I think that part of the argument that these things are important to people's communal heritage and worldview. We would understand that if we were to go to the Northwest Indian village, where yes, those totem poles that came about in a society that had mass slavery. But look, it's a very impressive piece of artwork. It's beautiful, and surely that has to count for something. And while we can note that this was built in a slave system, yet we can appreciate it. And I think that's the more kind of nuanced perspective that I'm hoping comes in. But it will also require, of course, the people who feel attached to these for communal reasons to stand up for them as well, and us to be able to have a more intelligent conversation, because right now the momentum is definitely with this sort of cultural radicalism, and how one stands up against it, I think, is one of the key questions of our time.
There was an incident in Washington where a Lincoln statue, the oldest Lincoln statue, in fact, which was paid for by freed slaves and dedicated by Frederick Douglass, there was a group that wanted to take them down, and a group of older African Americans from in the city basically showed up and shamed them out of it. I mean, they threatened to take it down. Those threats, still kind of endure, but there was a lot of footage of these basically older African American residents of the community saying that they appreciated the statue, that they didn't see the problem with it, that they wanted to maintain it, and that they viewed it as part of their community. And this back and forth where you have white men in man buns sort of telling people that they're wrong about this stuff is particularly frustrating for me, because it's a conversation that I think just illustrates a real gap of knowledge and appreciation. And there are a lot of folks out there who I think, would definitely not be in favor of pulling these things down, or if they are in favor of moving them, want to do so in a normal, legal, representative fashion. But that's not the conversation we're having. And instead, it's one of destruction. And in the words of one, the Washington Post global opinion editor deleted her tweet about this, but she talked about, revenge the other day as being, the motivating factor. And I think that people do feel like there's an attitude of that at the moment. What can we learn from history about any ways to keep this from becoming the type of revolutionary moment that you talked about? Basically, what can we do to tamp down on this a little bit and get some of these decisions back into the normal, democratic republic way of doing things, where we decide things at ballot boxes and in town meetings, and not because the mob wants them done?
Well, I mean, I think, to avoid what happened in China, for example, I think ultimately there's no substitute for making the intellectual argument against this completely elastic definition of terms like racism, that it has to be sharply defined. It can't just mean anything you want it to mean. And I think more responsible people have to say, reality is complex and world history is complex. And there are other values besides trying to scrub out anything that might be oppressive to anybody. Partly because I think a lot of what's going on is there's an attempt to sensitize, to tell African Americans, you should be outraged by this statue. In fact, a lot of these activists are really annoyed when African Americans aren't sufficiently alive to how outrageous such and such a statue is. So that it's not as though these populations are intrinsically offended by these statues. That offense has to be constructed by the ideology. And so I think it can be also similarly deconstructed, that a lot of African Americans might say, okay, look, we've actually made a lot of progress since that time. And this is a marker of progress. It's not a marker of somehow white triumphalism. And this is where it all comes down to the ideologies and the social construction and interpretation that statues and symbols and names of places don't just have one meaning. And we're being conned, I think, into believing that they just have one meaning. And I think someone's got to push back against that and say, no, there are many different meanings here. Yours is just one of 10. And you've got to respect the other 9, and you can't just push your way through because you think you're self-righteous. And that correction course to bring us towards a cultural center, I think, is sorely missing, because a lot of people don't have the arguments really to say. If someone says, oh, but Jefferson owned a slave, he's a racist, we must rub that out. A lot of people don't know how to respond. And instead of saying, actually, if we put that in the context of a world history that has basically been all about these things, if you think about the future where maybe all meat eaters are going to be knocked down, right? So trying to get people to think that things are a lot more complex and nuanced, and you can't collapse that into a very black and white worldview. And I agree, it's not as easy as simply shouting racism, right? To be able to say, we've got to have some sort of moderation, and you've got to have a more nuanced perspective. It's a harder and trickier argument to make, but responsible people, I think, do need to make it. And I also, one last thing is, I do think that the conservative, as I mentioned before, conservative politicians just haven't been engaged as much as they need to be on these symbolic issues. And you just if you look at another society, I use the example of Northern Ireland, where symbolic politics is extremely prominent. Now, that's not the other extreme we want to go to, but there are some lessons there for, if you want to defend these things, you actually have to get involved at many different policy levels of government. In, for example, education committees at state level that set texts and things. That has to become part of your politics. Otherwise, there's not much that's going to stand in the way of this.
Are there other lessons from Northern Ireland that conservative politicians here should take up?
Well, I'm not sure what lessons. I mean, clearly there are a lot of battles over symbolism. Which flag's going to fly? Is it the Union Jack or is it the Irish tricolor? And so on. But it's just to say that, each side, for example, if you take the Unionists, who in some ways, they have a shameful part of their history in that they discriminated against the Catholic population. But the way they reproduce their memory is very much they've got education and historical committees and private associations which take care of memorials, which advocate for symbolic positions. And while I think, perhaps they are too conservative on some dimensions, I just think that level of granularity of fighting for education and history and culture is something that I think is missing amongst conservatives in the West, and that there's going to have to be more attention paid to that level, and you don't get a lot of that out of the policy world on the right, it seems to me, where you've got very tried and true traditional things such as whether it be abortion, whether it be the Constitution or low tax or whatever. There are these grooves that are well trodden, but there does seem to be a weakness. I don't know I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, but it seems that there's a weakness when it comes to standing up to this very strong cultural revolutionary pressure coming out of university and media.
I think that the politicians that we have here, very few of them have spines on this front. And they're worried about being called racist, and they don't really know the language of how to defend these things. The irony being that they typically, when it comes time to raise money, they're happy to wrap themselves in the flag and invoke all the founders and everything like that, as if that's something that they're standing up for on a regular basis. But when it comes to the practical side of things, they would rather be dealing with dry policy and doing those well-trod grooves that you mentioned. Let's go out on this. I'm curious if there is any lesson that we can take away from the differences or similarities in our experience and in the experiences that you've seen in other countries regarding these recent phenomenons. What is the difference or the similarity in the way that something like this is playing out in America versus the way it's playing out in the UK?
Well, I think if you look at the statue issue, I mean, you can see a continuum with France on one side and Macron, who just said, no statue is going to be touched, that's it, and nothing happens. And then the United States or Canada, where I'm from, where essentially there is, there was much less resistance to this sort of spontaneous mob activity. And then Britain somewhere in the middle. They sort of didn't do much for about 10 days. There was a lot of, two things happened. One is that you had a lot of negative pressure from grassroots conservatives on the Conservative Party. And secondly, you also had figures like Nigel Farage and others who were attacking the government from the right, as well as sort of quite far-right elements that were moving in to protect statues. And so you actually had a lot of this pressure, which then kind of compelled the government to act. I think that it has kind of come under control in a way in Britain now, and there's legislation and against vandalism of war memorials and things. And so I guess I would say that the U.S. is it's starting to sort of come under control, perhaps in the U.S. I mean, it still seems like it's got life left in it in America, but I also think that this cultural nationalism is a more natural register in many European countries, that people would, even though they don't necessarily have the language to defend it, but they would instinctively kind of seek. They would say, this is horrendous, what's happening to Churchill's statue, etc. Whereas I think in the case of America, when Columbus goes down and I haven't seen the same level of cultural nationalism in a way, or at least I haven't seen it articulated in the same way that it would be in a place like France, for example.
Yeah, they really are not doing it, and I'm frustrated by that.
Well, maybe it's up to you. I don't know.
Yeah, sadly. Eric Kaufmann is the author of Whiteshift. You can follow him on Twitter at @EPKaufM, and you should read his piece at Quillette, which is the URL for it is Toward a New Cultural Nationalism, but the title is The Great Awokening and the Second American Revolution. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Great to be here, Ben.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.